Okay, good morning. Today is hopefully the last of the days that on this trip at least that I will be learning with you long distance and by recording. And God willing, tomorrow on Thursday, I will be back in person and looking forward to seeing you all. Okay, so where are we? We are in Masechet Nedarim. We are on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph. And let me share my screen and we will be ready to get started. So we are in the 10th perek of Nedarim, which is perek Nedarim Hamurasa. And in this perek, in this chapter, we are continuing our discussion of Nedarim of a Na'aram Ha'ma'orasa. This is a girl who of age 12 to 12 and a half, so she's a Na'ara, although it also would apply to a Katana, a girl who is under the age of 12 and who but is mature enough to make a neder. But in any event, this person, but now we're also talking about where the girl has done erisin. So she has a husband or a groom. She has not fully yet married, but she will be, hopefully, although we'll be talking about a situation today where she does not get fully married. But in any event, during this period of erisin, we've noted that the girl's father and the groom have joint rights to annul the vow. Both of them need to annul the vow in order for the vow to be annulled. If either of them confirms the vow or fails to annul it on the day that they hear about it, then the vow will be confirmed and the girl must fulfill it. So now the Mishnah introduces divorce and remarriage as we start at the top of Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph. So Nadra v'hi arusa. So again, she makes a neder while she was an arusa, and again, of course, we're talking about a nara. That's also a key element in this. Nisgarsha bo bayom, nisarsa bo bayom. If she then got divorced on that day and then remarried on that day, even to 100 men. So meaning it was a serial situation. She did erisin with man number one, and then realized, you know what, I don't really like him, and so he divorced her, and so on and so on. All the way through to 100, even if it was 100, then avia uvala ha'acharon mafirines nedireha. Then the father and her last husband, they have the power to revoke her vow, and this is obviously, presumably, a vow that she made right before, while she was still married to husband number one. So that's the story. Zehaklal. This is the general rule. The Mishnah says, as long as she does not become her own rishus, and that could be in two different ways. Either because she got fully married, or because she became an adult. So in either of those situations, even if it was for just a moment, aviu uvala, as long as that did not happen, aviu uvala, her father and her husband can revoke her vows. If, on the other hand, she were to be fully married at some point, well, then only the husband would have rights, presumably, although that's not the topic of our current Mishnah. Now, there's a machlokas achronim whether the last husband would need to be mefer that specific day, even if he hadn't heard. So we'll be seeing in our Gemara that Shmuel will say that we're talking about where the first husband heard on that day, And so now the question is now for the 100th husband, is he subject to that limitation of that first day? Or as long as he got married to her on that first day, then, he becomes like her full-fledged husband. And so just like a regular husband is not obligated to engage in the revoking in the hafara until he's heard about it, because of course you can't revoke something that you didn't hear about. So too, this new husband, maybe he will have until he actually hears about it in order to revoke. Alternatively, the alternative view is that no, because the first husband had already heard about it on that day, that's the timeline that for any kind of hafara, even if the person who's doing the hafara is a later husband. So that's a machlokas achronim. But in any event, in our Mishnah, it's not directly clear. What is clear is that the marriage, the erusin needs to have taken place on that same day, so that the new husband can stand in the place of the old husband. Okay, so now we've got our Mishnah, and now we're ready to take a look at the Gemara. So Minalan, the Gemara asks, Minalan de arus achron mefer nedarim sheniru la arus rishon. How do I know? How is it? How do we know that the last husband, the husband who has now performed erusin with her, has the power to revoke the neder, even though the first husband also had that ability? Okay, and the implication being that the first husband heard about it. And in that regard, the Ran explains that that this all is according to Shmuel, who's going to give the answer. So take a look in the first Ran on the Gemara. We'll just do the beginning of it through the almost the end of the narrow line. So this is about 3, 6, 9 lines, 7 lines into the narrow lines, where it says Gemara Minahan Emili de Aras Acharon Mefer Nedarim Sheniro Larishon. How do I know that the last husband has the ability to nullify to revoke a vow that was potentially that was seen by the first husband, meaning the first husband also had that ability but did not utilize it. That since the simple read is that since we're talking about where she got divorced on the day that she made the vow, and she did erusin on that same day, it must be that we're talking about a situation where the vow was heard, where the vow was learned about. Because if it wasn't heard, let's say by the first husband, well, then why did we need to talk about and limit our situation to a situation where she got remarried on that same day? If the first husband hasn't heard about it and the father hasn't heard about it, well, then nobody's heard about the vow. Who cares whether they get divorced on that day? What matters is what sets the timeline for the nullification, for the revocation of the vow, is the fact that somebody heard about it, namely either the husband or the father heard about it, and that will set the timeline for that person to revoke the vow. And just as an aside, I'm careful to use the term revoke as opposed to nullify, because there may be differences between hafara and hatara. Hatara, which is hataras nedarim, where you ask a chacham or a beit din in order to nullify a vow. So then the vow is as if it was never made. Exactly the nature of that nullification is still to be discussed. But here, when we deal with hafara, it's revoking, and it's clear that actions taken up to this time, until this time, the vow had actual validity, and so it's not quite as if, or it's not clear whether it's as if it never existed in the first place. But all right, in any event, v'nehi Deika l'dechuye Dilma masnisa. Now continuing back in the Ran, v'nehi deika l'dechuye Dilma masnisa b'shama av. Right, so we said that clearly it's got to be that somebody heard about the vow, because otherwise, why did everything have to happen on the same day? So clearly somebody heard about it. Well, maybe the person that heard about it isn't the husband, but it's rather the father. In which case, and that's why we're saying that it has to be on that day. But it wasn't the husband of Al Shama Arus. But maybe you could say that if it was in fact the first husband who heard about it, well, then maybe he's the only one who has the ability to undo, to revoke the vow, but the latter husband would not. Afilu hachi. So nonetheless, Shmuel Kibla Merabo. Shmuel had heard from his teacher, as again, he's going to be the one who's going to give the answer to this question. Dechitana Bo Bayom, that when our Mishnah said Bo Bayom, it was Mishum Shmias Aros Tanalei. It was because the husband was the one, the arusa, the arus, the husband who had done Erisin. He's the one who had heard. Amar Minahani Mili. And that's why this question, right? The question that's being asked by the Gemara at this moment is assuming that the first husband had the ability to nullify, revoke the vow. And the revocation requires that he know about it. So clearly he must have known about it. Dahai Minahani Mili Lav Hashas Kamar. That it wasn't just the Gemara Stam asking the question, Kamarlei, Ela Kula Midivrei Shmuel. Rather, all of this is from Shmuel himself. He, the Keilu Amar Hachi, and it's as if it was said the following: the Amar Shmuel Mina Hanimili de Arus Achron Mefer Nedarim Sheniro Larishon. How Shmuel says. So how do we know that the last Arus, the last of the husbands, has the ability to nullify, to revoke a vow that was seen by and thereby heard about by Larishon, by the first husband? So that's the question that the Gemara asks. So let's take a look and back into the Gemara, and we'll see the answer. So Amar Shmuel, as we continue now 7 lines down into the Gemara, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "V'im hayoti ish undareha aleha." If she shall be to a man, so see the double language, hayoti, that indicates multiple marriages, because the verb being in connection with a man is a reference to marriage, and undareha aleha. So nidarim shahayu aleha kvar. So the implication is that there was somebody to whom the vows were related to her already. So Dilma Hani Mili, so Shalom Nero La Aras Rishon. Well, 1 second. That only tells us the fact that the neder had been made earlier. How do you know that the first husband heard about it? This only tells us that maybe she made the vow while she was married to the first husband, or while she had Erisin with the first husband, but not that necessarily the first husband had heard about it. So aval, so the Gemara answers no, aval, and maybe as a result, aval nedarim sheniro la'aros rishon lo matzi mefer aros achor, and maybe once the first husband had heard about it, and then the last husband would not be able to revoke the vow. So aleha kra yiserahu. No, the word aleha is extra. We don't need it in this verse, and so as a result, it comes to teach us that in fact these nedarim that were heard about, that she had made earlier, were in fact heard about by her first husband. Okay, and Tanya Kavase de Shmuel, and now we're going to cite a brisa that supports Shmuel, and actually this brisa is one that we saw in the last few days, and we'll but you know what, before and then in the last few days, because this is the brisa that served as the source of the machlokas between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai that we saw a few days ago. So let's take a look and see what it says. So what does the Brisa say? Na'araham orasa avia uvala mafirin nedareha. So if you have, as we saw in, of course, our first Mishnah in this parak, that if you have a Na'ara who is an Arusa, meaning again that she had done Erisin with her husband, but had not done Nisuin, so then both her father and her husband can revoke the vows. And they need to revoke them together. Ketzad, how does this happen? Shama aviha v'hefer law. So first the father needs to, or it doesn't make a difference the order, but the father hears the vow and revokes it. Below hispik habal lishmoa ad shemait. But now 1 second. What happens if before the husband heard about it, he died? V'nis arsa bo bayom. And she then becomes married again on that same day, even 100 times. So avia uvala ha'acharon mefirin nidareha. So her father and the last husband have the ability to revoke the vow. Now, let me remind you of the machlo. Well, you know what? Let's go through the rest of this brisa, and then we'll come back to the first case. But shama bala v'hefer law. Now, what happens if the husband heard about it and revoked it for him? Below hispik ha'av lishmoa ad shemes habal, and the father did not manage to hear about it and revoke the vow until the husband died. So choser ha'av umefer chelko shalbal. So the first position in our brisa says that the father can revoke the vow, and the fact that the first husband had revoked the vow, that stays in effect, and the father can now revoke the vow on his own. Amar Rabbi Nasan, hein divrei Beit Shammai. That's what Beit Shammai says. Abal Beit Hillel omrim, ein yachol lahaper. He doesn't have the ability to revoke the vow. And this again reminds us of the machlokas that we saw a couple of days ago in connection with between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. That Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagree. B'mai pligi, that's what we're going to deal with. In fact, let's continue on. B'mai pligi, what is it that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are arguing about? And then we'll come back and take a look at each of the pieces. So Beit Shammai sabri nedarim nami shiroi la'arus nisrokna rishus la'ab. That Beit Shammai says that when it comes to nedarim that are as long as they're fit to be annulled by to be revoked by the first arus, so now the right then transfers to the father with the death of the first arus. So now it's totally, even whether or not the first arus revoked the vow, whatever's left goes to the father, because umigas gayas, because whatever the arus did, he only revokes his half of the vow. So essentially, what we have is the vow of a na'ara hamurosa can be broken into two pieces. One that is needs to be revoked by the father, and one that needs to be revoked by the husband. And if the husband revokes his part, well, the full part of the father still remains and is capable of being inherited by him, and thereby, even after the first arus dies, he can revoke the vow. That's the concept of megas gaius, that it's cut in half. It's almost like, again, you could imagine if the entire square, you have an entire square of the vow, and then smack down the middle, you have two halves, one half for the father to revoke, and one half for the husband to revoke. And so as a result, what happens in one half essentially doesn't affect the other. Beit Hillel, right? But on the other hand, Beit Hillel disagrees with this and says, Avia uvala achron mefirin nedareha. That no, it is not the first. If the first husband had revoked, and it is not just left for the father to revoke, because once the first husband has not revoked at the same time that the father has revoked, all he's done is lessen the entire level of the shvua. So it's not as if you split it vertically, but rather almost like you split it horizontally, where the entire level and strictness associated with the neder has become lowered, and as a result, what's left is not capable of being revoked only by the husband and by the father, and the father doesn't inherit that right. And lo migas, guys, it's not cut away evenly. It's rather depressed the level of the neder, and so as a result, we have the following fundamental disagreement between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says that when the husband dies, if the neder that is left is not a full neder, then it's not going to all go to the husband, to the father, and so the father will not have the ability to revoke it on his own. On the other hand, if nothing has happened to the neder, well, then Beit Hillel would agree with Beit Shammai, and the whole thing after the first husband died would all go to the father. But Beit Shammai says not only when there's a full vow does the vow go fully to the father when the husband dies, but even if the husband or the father were to have been Mayfair, were to have revoked the vow, and so what you have left is only half a vow, that half a vow is sufficiently important, whether it's the husband's half of the vow or the father's half of the vow, is a sufficient thing for it to be transferred to the father. So that is the machlokas between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So now that we have that, we're ready to go back to take a look at the Ran on Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph and see that in fact, when it came, again, let's go back to say the first case in our in this brisa. So the brisa had two cases. The first case in our brisa was where the husband did not hear, but the father had revoked. Now remember, when we saw this machlokas between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai several days ago, we saw that that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai would disagree even in the situation where the father revoked. That if the father revoked and then the husband died, according to Beit Shammai, the father would inherit the full right to revoke, and so as a result, the revocation would be a full revocation. On the other hand, Beit Hillel said, no, once you have the father revoking, so then what's left is a non-significant item, and as a result, the father would not have the ability to ever revoke the vow. Okay, but what did our first case involve? Our first case said, well, what happens is, so again, the father heard and revoked the vow, but the husband did not hear about it and did not revoke the vow. And so as a result, but unlike the case that we dealt with a few days ago, where there was the machlokas between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, now the woman becomes married a second time. And so because she becomes married a second time, or even 100 times, now the beginning of our brisa says, Avia uvala ha'acharon mafirin nedareha, that together the husband and the father have the ability to revoke the vow. So now the question is this really according to Beit Hillel as well? Or is this only according to Beit Shammai? Because again, the latter part of the brisa, we end up saying that those are the words of Beit Shammai. So does that also affect the first case of the brisa? And again, the second case of the brisa is where the husband heard and revoked, but the father had not heard. And so, and then the husband dies. And so as a result, the father is not able to revoke on his own, according to Beit Hillel. So let's take a look. So now let's take a look in the third, sixth, seventh wide line of the widest lines in the Ran on Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph. So Avia Uvala Acharon Mefirin Nedarim. So again, in the first case of this brisa, both the father and the husband have the right to be meifir, to revoke the neder together. So Pershu Tzad HaRishonim. So some Rishonim Zal that some people say that understand that this actually refers to is divrei hakol, that this is not only according to Beit Shammai, but even Beit Hillel would agree with this. The plug to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel beidach bava, that belachudhi, that it's only in the other case where the husband made the husband revoked before he died, but the father had not yet revoked, and so as a result, Beit Hillel says he can't revoke, he can't do anything, and Beit Shammai says he can. Utmeheni leBeit Hillel, but it's a wonder according to Beit Hillel. Desvirulhu maklash kalish, because we saw that Beit Hillel says that what happens is the total vow becomes weakened. That in the situation where the father heard about it and nullified it, the iklish lay high nadra, and so that the neder became weakened because the father himself had dealt with it, and this is the case that we saw a few days ago. The akasi isib la'av below batla la hafara delay, that when now he gets it, his hafara has not gone away. So heiki matzu aras achron lahefer. So how in the world can the father and the last husband, the last arus, be the ones that nullify? That in the case earlier, the shama avia behaviorla, where the father heard about it and nullified and revoked the vow, below his bikabal lishmoa ad shemes, and the husband did not have a chance to do anything until before he died. De'ain ha'av yachol lahafer. That we said that the husband does not have the father does not have the ability to revoke the vow. Ubeki hai gavna lo amrinin meis habal nisrokna rishus la'av. And we don't say in that situation that the father gets the entire right because the husband died. Mishum de kevan de iklishle, because the vow had become weakened. Nadra lo chashiva laho risho la'av. The neder is no longer sufficiently important that it can be inherited to the father. V'hachinami, but in this case also, ki ika ava aris achron maishna. What's the difference when you have a second husband? Who cares if there's a second husband? Isn't the issue the fact that the father cannot inherit it, and so as a result, the father should never be able, the vow should never be able to be nullified. So v'nir be'enai lefi divrei hemzal. So the Ran answers that according to their words, we could understand it as follows: Dahainu taima, that this is the reason that in this case. So again, in the case where the husband was the father was Mayfair, and then the husband died, we say that the father does not have the ability to unilaterally revoke, because the weakened state of the neder is not fully inheritable, and so even though it was weakened based on the father's own revocation, and so as a result, there's nothing to do. And yet here, in a very similar situation, we say that if the father revoked and the husband died, if the husband was replaced, then the father and the husband have the ability to revoke the vow. So what's the difference between those two cases? Well, naturally, the difference is that there's a new husband. So the hainu time mishum dela'el deikashinuye rishus demantic lay. That the issue is that when there's only the father, so then the revocation rights need to transfer from a husband to a father. And for them to transfer from a husband to the father, so hi Nedarim arus la'ab kol hechi de kalish le lo matzi manki. Well, when it's a very weak neder that is already been partially nullified, that's not enough for it to transfer from the husband to the father. But in this case, when there is a new husband, the last one, the last husband, basically steps into the shoes of the first husband. The kaven to arus kaasi, and since it goes only from one arus to another arus, one husband to another husband, afal gafta iklish, even though it was a weakened thing, nadra matzi the iklish lay nadra, even though it was a weakened neder, matzi avu baal lahafer, the father and the husband have the ability to work together, because the husband has the ability to step into the shoes of the original husband. And there's no kind of inheritance here of the flow of the right to revoke the vow. And so as a result, that's the situation that we're talking about. And so now what we've done is we've explained that, again, the first situation of the brisa could be according to both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Now, what were we bringing this brisa for? Let's remind ourselves. We were bringing this brisa as a proof for Shmuel. Now, Shmuel said that our Mishnah was saying that if the first husband, not only if the vow was made while the first husband was married to the woman, was married with an erison only to the woman, but even if the first husband had heard about the vow and then divorced her, and then she got married to up to 100 more people, or even more. It's 100 is just as a random number to say that to highlight that it can happen over and over again. The last husband still will retain the right to revoke. So the question is how do we know that this is in fact true if the first husband had heard about it? Well, again, now the proof is not from our first case, but rather from the second case of the brisa. So let's focus again back on the second case of the brisa, and let's take a look at that. And that is that second case is Shama Bala Beheferla. So that is 1, 2, 3, 5 lines up on Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph. So again, the husband has now heard and revoked. So clearly, we're talking about a situation where there was a revocation. So below hispik ha'av l'shmoa, meaning clearly the first husband had heard about it. Below hispik ha'av l'shmoa ad shemes habal, and now the husband didn't. The father had not heard about it before the husband died. So chozer ha'avu meifir chelko shel baal. So according to Beit Shammai, the father has the ability to revoke the first, to do the full revocation on his own. Well, the implication of that is that the first husband, if the first husband doesn't do anything, then although the father has the full ability to revoke the vow when the daughter isn't in Arusa, so then if she becomes an Arusa again that day, so then the new husband assumes responsibility over the first husband's portion of the neder. So the husband and father would need to revoke together. So that's the implication according to Beit Shammai. So even though our case here is a case where the first husband did a revocation, if he hadn't done a revocation, well, then the entire thing would be inherited by the father. And then when she got remarried, she'd be back to a Nara Me'orosa. And again, a Nara Me'orosa, it doesn't make a difference when she made the neder, even if she made the neder before they were actually, erison was done, it still applies. So Beit Shammai would clearly say that even in the case in our Mishnah, you would, even if the first husband had heard about it and then they got divorced, the latter husbands will have the right to revoke the vow together with the father. And what about Beit Hillel? Well, Beit Hillel said the following, right? So Beit Hillel said that in the situation where the first husband had the right to revoke and used the right to revoke, well, now that the that it, and then the husband died before the father revoked, well, so the father at that moment has nothing to do. But if in fact the husband would get the woman would get remarried again, so then the implication is that in fact the father and the husband would have the right to revoke together. And so as a result, the fact that they have the right to revoke together shows that in the case in our Mishnah, even Bein Hillel would agree that if there was a second husband, then there would be an ability to revoke the neder by the husband and the father working together. And so therefore, we have in fact shown that our Baraisa actually proves our case. And so we see that in fact, Shmuel is correct that our Mishnah must be talking not only about a case where the neder was made while the woman was married to the first husband, but even the first husband had heard about the neder and didn't do anything about the neder, and now divorced her, and she gets married to many more people. The last one on that same day will still have the ability to revoke the vow together with the father. And so that's the end of our proof. And now we're ready for more questions. And indeed, the next question is going to be, well, what happens if the second husband is the first husband? Meaning, what if she gets married back to the first husband immediately, right? We know that in Jewish law, a woman's allowed to remarry her first husband as long as she hasn't married somebody else in the meantime. But so what happens if that's the case? Do we say that because the first husband had not done anything during the first time that he was married to her, that's it? It's as if he had said, I don't really care about this vow, and now he comes back, he still shouldn't be able to care about the vow? Or do we say, no, he's back to where he was, let him care about the vow? And so as a result, for the analysis of that interesting situation, you're going to have to stay tuned to tomorrow's daf. So I wish you a wonderful day, and God willing, I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow back in person.